Harris is not fit to be president of the United States. She doesn't have the intellect.
He does not prioritize the freedom of women and the intelligence of women to make decisions about their own lives and bodies.
Kamala Harris is way more interested in Donald Trump's past than she is your future.
J.D. Vance and Donald Trump know nothing about working class people other than how to take advantage of them.
Hi, I'm Scott McFarland, CBS News in New York, and welcome to America Decides. We're just 5 days out from Election Day now, and the candidates are out west, courting voters in the western battlegrounds. Vice President Harris and former President Trump are both in Nevada and Arizona. Trump's also rallying in New Mexico today, a typically reliably blue state. In Wisconsin last night, Trump got behind the wheel of a garbage truck, quote, in honor of Kamala and Joe Biden. He seized on the president's remarks where he was alleged to have called Republican supporters of Trump garbage. But now Trump is facing criticism for comments of his own, this time about women.
I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them.
Listen, it actually is, I think, very offensive to women in terms of not understanding their agency, their authority, their right, and their ability to make decisions about their own lives.
Let's begin tonight with Lilia Luciano and Nicole Killian, both in Nevada, both with the candidates. Lilia is following the Harris campaign in Las Vegas, Nicole with the Trump campaign down the street in Henderson. Nicole, Trump has a long history of making allegedly disparaging remarks about women. Let's take a listen to some of them.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account
Only Rosie O'Donnell. 7% for Bird Brain. You know Bird Brain? I will never run against him. He is a great president. I will never, ever run against him, said Bird Brain. No one trusts her. No one takes her seriously. Everyone knows she is a very low IQ individual.
So, Nicole, how concerned is the Trump campaign about the fallout about his protector remark?
You know, I don't think they're very concerned at all. And I think, you know, the former president, in terms of talking to some of his supporters here in Nevada, really, at least those I talked to, didn't seem to take a lot of offense to the comments. But they did acknowledge that he could have said it in a better way, that, you know, maybe he was just trying to convey that he would look out for women in the sense of, quote unquote, protecting them. So they didn't see it as a slight. And in fact, several of them have already early voted. So at this point for them, it's kind of moot because their votes have already been cast. But I did talk to some other voters today who support the vice president, who did take offense to the comments, you know, kind of along the same lines of what we heard from the vice president, saying that, you know, ultimately it should be women who have the ultimate authority and agency over their own body. And so for that reason, they didn't take too kindly to the former president's remarks. Here's a sampling of some of the reaction we got from voters earlier today here in Henderson, Nevada.
I think his comment was because maybe people can't see that he's trying to protect them, and he'll do it regardless of what they think his ulterior motive is.
I just don't know how he could say that women should not have abortions, whether they were raped, whether they were young, whether a medical reason. I just firmly believe it's a woman's right.
So again, it kind of depends who you talk to in terms of how those comments played. But as we know, certainly the vice president is making a strong push for women, and for the former president's part as well. He's trying to make more inroads because we know that there is a gender gap, with the former president really leading among men, the vice president leading among women. But obviously comments like that could make it a little tougher for the former president to close the gap.
Okay, Lily, let's shift over to you in Las Vegas. How is the vice president's campaign trying to capitalize on these remarks from former President Trump?
The campaign and the candidate, Vice President Harris, is absolutely trying to capitalize. As you heard in that sound that you played at the top, Scott, we heard her talking about how, you know, the importance of sending the message about women's agency over their own bodies. The way that the campaign is receiving this and talking about this, what Kamala Harris says is that everybody should be offended. And remember that a big part of her campaign is about freedom. I mean, starting from the music to the messaging for women's freedom to choose to have that agency agency over their bodies. And so part of what people are reacting to is this is precisely what a lot of women fear. The idea that decisions will be made where they don't have a say. A lot of what we're going to hear about today, we expect here in Las Vegas, is part of those closing arguments of the Harris campaign, where she's saying, to Latinos, to the community here in Vegas, and to women having J-Lo as a speaker, precisely is that this is about them taking the power, the agency, the fate over their own bodies. And here in Nevada, there is a ballot measure that is precisely about abortion, about making it part of the state's constitution to allow abortions until fetal viability.
At the same time, as she makes this western swing, Lilia, how's the vice president trying to reach out to Latino voters in these battleground states?
Well, in this battleground state in particular, Scott, this is the 9th time that Harris has visited the state throughout the campaign. And of course, she's had a far shorter campaign than former President Trump. She has activated, or at least, the Get Out the Vote organizing that has happened here within the Culinary Union, which is a force getting people galvanized to vote and which has endorsed her. What I'm hearing from them is that their plan is to knock on 900,000 doors to talk directly, or have already spoken directly to 130,000 people across the state. As I mentioned, J-Lo is speaking tonight. Maná, which is the most famous, celebrated rock en español band of all time, I would say. And of course, I know that people will argue that it's Soda Stereo. We can have that conversation later. At least the band that is surviving is going to play here. So that is sure to bring a whole lot of people out here to this venue. It doesn't hold tens of thousands of people, but thousands are expected to show up. And she continues to send the message to Latinos that, especially after what happened last Sunday with that comment about Puerto Rico, that what her campaign represents is unity and not division and not rejecting of certain communities.
And Nicole, back in Henderson, union votes are always so pivotal in Nevada. What inroads is the former president making or trying to make with them?
Well, look, that is a key part of both campaign strategy. Time and again, we hear the former president talk about having support from Teamsters or from the UAW, even though we know the Teamsters didn't make a formal endorsement of the former president, and the UAW, for the most part, supports Vice President Kamala Harris. Obviously, the bigger union here in town is the Culinary Union. But look, I think the former president, for the most part, continues to try to make this appeal to working class individuals. We actually heard some of that argument earlier today when he was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, kind of taking a detour from the battleground states to go to New Mexico, which is not as competitive. But he did outline some new proposals that he said would bring prices down by cutting regulations. He said he would enact one of the largest reductions in regulations in history, again, to try to bring down cost for the average American. So that is just a sampling of the former president's argument as he tries to keep the economy in focus during this Western stint, as well as the border.
Nicole Killian, Lilia Luciano, thank you both. More than 60 million people have already voted in this presidential race, and we're tracking the mountain of ballots cast in the battleground states so far and what it could mean for the eventual outcome. CBS News Deputy Director of Elections and Data Analytics, Kabir Khanna, joins us now. Kabir, good to have you here. Your time is precious. What can you tell us about who's been voting so far?
Good to see you, Scott. So as of this hour, 63 million ballots cast so far around the country, a very healthy early turnout. For context, that's about 40% of the total expected votes we expect to see in this election. They're coming about half from mail ballots and about half at early voting centers around the country. Let me take you on a quick tour of 3 battleground states that we're keeping a very close eye on this year. So in Georgia, we've seen 3.6 million ballots cast, primarily at early in-person voting centers. In Pennsylvania, we've seen 1.6 million. That's the largest of these 3 states. That's about a quarter of all the votes we expect out of that state. And in Arizona, we've seen 1.8 million. That's roughly half of what we expect to see out of Arizona. In terms of who is voting early, let's look at some demographic breaks. So one thing that's interesting is that consistently we see it's mostly women who have cast their ballots already. Now, a lot of people will look at that gap and say, well, that's good news for the Democrats, right? Well, it's not that simple. But for context, in 2020, most early voters were women too, and the percentages are very similar year to year. All three of these states were very close in 2020, decided by 1 percentage point or less. So just because you see these demographic breaks, it's too soon to predict whether one side or the other will win. One other thing I want to say about demographics is that most early voters are older, and they're typically people who voted 4 years ago and also who voted early 4 years ago. These are habitual voters turning out early. What we haven't seen yet in the data is a surge of young voters or new registrants or first-time early voters, but there's plenty of time for them to get their ballots in, Scott.
Is there any reason for either party to be enthused by what those numbers are?
Well, it is very tricky to read the tea leaves in this data, but let me show you 2 states where we actually know the party registration of early voters. In Pennsylvania, it's mostly Democrats casting those mail ballots, 57% to 33% Republican. In Arizona, the party split on party registration is a little more balanced, but it's mostly Republicans. But here's one thing I should tell you. Of these registered Republicans in Pennsylvania who voted early, about half of them voted on Election Day 4 years ago. So there is some shifting in how people cast their votes, perhaps not surprising given the Trump campaign's emphasis this year on banking votes. So this Democratic margin isn't as wide as it was 4 years ago, but again, that's not a big surprise. Let me show you one other thing, because something you'll often hear party operatives say is that our side's early turnout is good because we're getting low propensity and new voters out. We're adding people to our tally, whereas the other side is just cannibalizing people who would have shown up anyway. Well, we tried to estimate that at the data desk. We looked at the voter file and looked at everyone who's a likely voter this year for each party. How many of them have shown up so far? In Pennsylvania, about a quarter of likely Democratic voters have cast a vote already. Compare that to about 15% of likely Republican voters in the state. Well, what that means is that 85% of likely Republican voters have yet to vote. They're still out there, and those remaining voters are who the parties are trying to mobilize in this final stretch. What it also means is that while Democrats may be banking a vote lead in a place like Pennsylvania, there's plenty of ground that Republicans can make up in the last few days and on Election Day, and that's precisely what we'll be tracking at the data desk on Tuesday night, Scott.
Lots of work ahead. Kabir Khanna, thank you very much. And you can watch Election Night with the CBS News team live from our election headquarters here in New York and with our team spread out all across the country. Join us for real-time results, analysis, and exclusive polling. Coverage begins at 4 p.m. Eastern on CBS News 24/7 and 7 p.m. Eastern on CBS. Roy Cooper's 8-year tenure as governor of North Carolina comes to an end in 2 months, and the Democratic candidate running to fill his shoes joins us next. You're streaming America Decides. Not just the presidential election taking place next week, 11 states are also selecting their next governors, and that includes the battleground state of North Carolina. Josh Stein is running to become that state's next governor, currently serves as North Carolina's Attorney General, and joins us from the state capitol in Raleigh. And Mr. Stein, you have this battleground state that everybody's focusing on, which means it's got some purple dynamics. How do you make inroads as a Democrat in those less predictable purple areas?
Well, we're definitely a purple state. Our races always go down to the wire. And the way you win is pretty basic. You talk about issues that matter to folks. Public safety, making sure their neighborhoods are safe. That the economy continues to grow and works for more people. That we get costs down. That our educational system is excellent and our teachers are well paid. Because those issues that I just talked about, they're not red issues, they're not blue issues, they are North Carolina issues. And if folks see you out there fighting for them and delivering for them, they'll reward you and hire you again.
I suspect some voters, maybe some from the red column, some from the blue column, are asking you how you'd be different than the current Democratic governor, Governor Cooper. How do you answer that question?
Well, I think exceptionally highly of Governor Cooper, known him very well for a quarter of a century now. I worked for him for 8 years when he was Attorney General. He is thoughtful, hardworking, focused on solving people's real problems, and that's the kind of governor I will aim to be.
Well, he has navigated this supermajority North Carolina has in its Republican-controlled Senate, which has veto power to a degree on so much of what the governor does. How are you going to navigate that if Republicans keep that supermajority in the legislature?
Well, the one good thing about the elections in North Carolina is all 170 legislative seats are up for election. So we have the chance to break the supermajority that exists of Republicans in North Carolina in each chamber. We're only down one seat in the House and one seat in the Senate. And there are a lot of swing districts out there, so we're working hard to get out our supporters so that we can break the supermajority and, frankly, restore balance to state government. I worked well on a number of issues with the Republican General Assembly. We eliminated the largest backlog of untested rape kits in the country together. We have tackled the opioid and fentanyl crisis together. We have modernized our laws to protect kids from child sex abuse and to deal with the threats that artificial intelligence pose. So we've been working together well, and I can continue to do that. But I think we will work best if neither side has total power in state government. That's why I'm working exceptionally hard to break the supermajorities in the General Assembly.
Well, let's talk about the Republican Lieutenant Governor, your opponent, Mark Robinson. Some have called on him to resign after that CNN report that posted a slew of incendiary comments on a pornographic website about a decade ago. Robinson has denied the report and accused you and your team of leaking that story to CNN. How did you respond to that allegation, and how is this controversy impacting your strategy as you campaign?
Well, I learned about the controversy in the same time everybody else who watched CNN at 4 p.m. that afternoon. But look, the CNN had allegations that were despicable, absolutely despicable, calling himself a Nazi, glorifying Hitler, glorifying slavery. I mean, just terrible things. But anybody who has studied this man and the things that are on his Facebook page today know that he is unfit for any office of public trust, let alone the governorship of North Carolina. I mean, he says women are not called to lead. He says women only have abortions because they cannot keep their skirts down. He called public school teachers wicked, gay people he's called filth. This summer, from, of all places, a church pulpit, he yelled that some folks need killing. Those were his words. This is not the vision, the temperament, the character of anyone we need in office in North Carolina.
And reaffirming that he did deny the details of the CNN report. Let's shift to the hurricane. Hurricane Helene has still left the state in recovery mode, but all that misinformation was spread about the federal government's response to it, including by former President Trump. What's your measure on how federal officials are doing helping Western North Carolina?
They're working hard. The state is working hard. Local government is working hard. Nonprofit organizations are working hard. People are working hard. The extent of devastation is really hard to process. Essentially, it went from Georgia all the way to the Virginia line, counties wide. And people's lives have been turned completely upside down. I mean, many people lost loved ones. Many people lost their homes and all their possessions. Many small business owners have built up years of sweat equity, and their businesses just all washed away in the flood. So the scale is immense. We need to be there for the people of Western North Carolina. And when I say we, I mean everyone in this country. The local governments, there is no way they have the resources to respond. There's not enough resources in North Carolina to respond. We need the federal government and our federal representatives to go to bat for us, and I believe that they will, to make sure that we have an adequate set of appropriations to respond to the level and extent of the damage.
In this home stretch to Election Day, a candidate's time is especially valuable, so we're grateful you shared it with us. Attorney General Josh Stein in Raleigh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
Up next, we ask two partisan polling experts about what these early voting numbers we've told you about say about the state of the 2024 race. You're streaming America Decides.
I wanted to make sure my vote is in, signed, sealed, and delivered.
I think the Republican Party has gone down the wrong path.
I don't think as a human being he has a great personality, but I like the issues and I like what he stands for.
Those are just a few of the more than 60 million voters who have cast their ballots early this year. So what do we know about this big slice of the electorate that's already made their decision? Let's bring in some experts, Tom Bonnier and John Couvillon. They join us now. Tom's a veteran Democratic political strategist and the senior advisor at the political data organization Target Smart. John's a Republican political strategist and founder of JMC Analytics and Polling. Tom, let's start with you. This early vote has historically benefited Democrats, but it looks a little different this year, and people are having difficulty getting a measure for it. What do you make?
Yeah, well, there's a good reason for that. So 2020 was a unique year, to put it mildly. We know the impact the pandemic had. We had a mass expansion of the early voting around the country, and we know Democrats were much more COVID conscious, so they were much more likely to vote before Election Day. We're seeing a lot of vote reversion back to how people voted before the pandemic. We have to remember at the same time in 2020, there was a mass evacuation of Republicans from the early vote. Donald Trump told them that voting by mail was fraudulent. So Republicans have been putting a lot of effort into getting their votes out early. We're seeing some minor movement towards Republicans in these battleground states, but perhaps not as big as they hoped or expected.
John, the election officials in Georgia are calling their early vote record-shattering. What do you think about these numbers and the efforts by the Trump campaign to flip Georgia back to red?
So the interesting thing about Georgia, and this is something that I have seen in other Deep South states where you can track the racial component of early voting, is that Black early voting is noticeably down relative to 2020. And where that matters the most, of course, is in Georgia and North Carolina, where Kamala Harris absolutely needs a robust Black turnout to be able to carry those states.
Let's look at broader then, John. What other states should give the Trump campaign pause, and which ones should make them optimistic?
So what's interesting is when I look at across the country, what's actually happening is that overall early voting is down relative to this point in time in 2020. More specifically, in 2020, I showed that 77 million had early voted at this point, and there was a 17-point Democratic spread. As of this morning, we're looking at 64 million early votes with a 3-point Democratic spread. Now, with regards to the specific states, the ones that I think the Trump campaign can feel more comfortable about, I think Arizona is actually a good example where you're talking about a Democratic lead of +4 that has gone to a Republican lead of +8. Similarly, in Nevada, Democrat +6 to Republican +5. North Carolina, Democrat +8 to Republican +2. The only thing that they would be concerned about, but this is not a heavy early voting state, would be Pennsylvania, where the Democrats had a 46-point lead at this point in time in 2020. Right now, they have a 23-point lead. And Pennsylvania is the kind of state that even with the expansion of mail-in voting in 2020, thanks to the pandemic, you still have a culture where over 80% of the vote is cast on Election Day.
Tom, so much of the recent polling in Pennsylvania has that race estimated as tied. So how do you read the early vote in Pennsylvania and how the Harris campaign, what they have to do to keep the Pennsylvania vote intact and keep the whole blue wall intact?
Well, as John just mentioned, what we've seen is a closing of the gap. Democrats just absolutely dominated the early vote in Pennsylvania 4 years ago by almost a 3-to-1 margin. Again, Donald Trump has told his supporters it's okay to vote by mail this time. You're seeing a lot of them coming back. The reason why I think Democrats still feel good about what they're seeing is almost 50% of the Republicans who have voted by mail so far were just Election Day voters last time around, meaning Republicans aren't creating new votes out of the vote by mail. They're really just converting Election Day voters to early voters. And in fact, when you look at the new registrants, people who have registered to vote in Pennsylvania over the last 4 years, Democrats still have a 20-point advantage among those early voters.
Tom, I want to quickly touch on either Michigan or North Carolina. We have reports out of Michigan about robust turnout so far, and North Carolina was brought up by John. Do you have a read on either of those two states?
Yeah, Michigan's a fascinating one to me. We expected to see the vote shift at least slightly Republican in every state because of everything I've mentioned. In Michigan, our models are actually showing the early vote leaning more Democratic than it was at this point in 2020. We've seen record-breaking early voting numbers in the early in-person in Detroit. We're seeing big numbers from Black seniors, especially in Wayne County. So again, I think the Harris campaign likely feels pretty good about those numbers in Michigan.
John and Tom, we thank you for your time. John in Baton Rouge and Tom from our D.C. newsroom right near my desk. Thank you both. Appreciate it. Former President Trump's garbage truck photo op yesterday went viral. But will that viral image actually move the needle for the Trump campaign? Our political panel will discuss next. You're streaming America Decides.
I have to begin by saying 250 million Americans are not garbage. Without question, my supporters are far higher quality than Crooked Joe or Lion Kamala.
Trying to spin garbage into gold. That's what former President Trump attempted to do by donning a sanitation worker vest and driving a garbage truck, or at least sitting in one, in Wisconsin last night. But just how long can the garbage controversy carry on before it becomes as potentially nauseating as an actual garbage dump? Our political panel is who we turn to for answers. Joel Payne's a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist, and Lance Trover, a Republican strategist in Laguna Hills, California. He served formerly as a spokesperson for North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum's 2024 presidential campaign. Lance, let me start with you. Do you think this sanitation worker bit could appeal to undecided voters versus just the Trump base?
Well, I think you first need to take a look at why he was in a garbage truck. It's because the sitting president of the United States, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris's partner over the last 4 years, called all Trump supporters and basically half of America garbage the other night.
He didn't call them all garbage. I think they immediately clarified to say he was referring to the comic who made the racist joke.
I think, Scott, we all saw the video. It's pretty clear about whom he was speaking. I mean, I know what the White House's spin on this is, but let's call it for what it is. We saw the video and what he said. And that's why he was in the garbage truck here today. But I think the finer point here is what this has allowed the Trump campaign to do is really hone in on what his message has been for 8 years since he came down the escalator in 2015, which is that the system in Washington is rigged against you, that people in Washington, politicians for many years, think you are deplorable, they think you are garbage. And there is only one person to fix it, and that's an outsider and someone like him. And so that is what I think has allowed this to go viral, and that is, I think, brought it all back home for him. And look, the voters are going to decide this in a few short days, but I think it's really a strong closing argument for him, and certainly something I don't think he expected to get.
And Joel, let me shift to you. The president did try to clear this up. The vice president has said that he was clearly correcting himself moments later, but that hasn't stopped this from being a controversy that has taken away their attention and their focus and their bandwidth. What should the Harris campaign do to put an end to this, if they can do something to put an end to this?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear Lance's POV on this, because when I saw Donald Trump in that garbage truck and slipping and sliding to get into that truck, and then also with that reflector vest on, I thought he was referring to him calling America a garbage can, which he said several times in recent weeks, and calling Americans who don't agree with him scum. And I thought it was the sundry of thing, and maybe even a reference back, obviously, to his opening act at MSG. So I kind of thought that's what he was referring to. I thought it was a little strange that he would remind people that those are the things that he and his supporters routinely say. As for Kamala Harris, one of the things that's interesting to me is, look, President Biden misspoke and clarified that he misspoke. But I actually think it's an interesting split screen, because Kamala Harris, I think, demonstrated how different she is and how different her vision is for the country by actually showing that she does not talk about people in the ways that Donald Trump talks about people, or the way that people have tried to misrepresent what Joe Biden says. Her speech on the ellipse a few days ago and her follow-up, comments afterwards, I think, demonstrate that she represents a new way forward and a different brand of leadership. So actually, I think it was a good moment for her to put some distance between the politics of the past and where she wants to take the country going forward.
And Lance, today a Pennsylvania judge decided not to block Elon Musk's $1 million giveaways to people who signed that political action committee petition he circulates, electing to place the lawsuit on hold while a federal court decides whether to take this up or not take this up. Is that a win of some sort for Musk or Trump? Is that a meter-moving win for either of them?
I think at this stage of the game, I'm not sure of any voter who's really focused too much on what Elon Musk is doing or not doing. Unless you're that area who's signing the petition and maybe could win $1 million, then yeah, it's a victory for that person. But other than that, I don't see a whole lot of focus by any voter out there in terms of what he's doing. Every time, though, that Democrats go and try to stop Elon Musk. They just help bring further light into his message and what he wants to talk about, which is promoting Donald Trump and the fact that his efforts to clean up the government. But again, this is not, to me, as a political strategist, I don't see any voters out there really worried about what Elon Musk is doing on a daily basis.
Let's talk about the Speaker of the House, who today in New York tried to defend his comments about the future of the Affordable Care Act. He's accused Vice President Harris of lying after her campaign said Johnson and Trump would work to get rid of Obamacare. Let's listen to the House Speaker from this afternoon.
No one's repealing the ACA, but there are lots of ideas on both sides of the aisle on how we can continually improve the system, and that's an ongoing effort. It should be for every single member of the Congress. I think our constituents demand that, and we have ideas on how to do that.
Lance, you first. In 2010 and 2018, boy, the Affordable Care Act was either incredibly helpful or incredibly unhelpful to each party. What do you think the impact of this could be in the final days, Lance, on voters?
As a political operative, I commend the Harris campaign for trying to talk about this today and not the garbage comments, which they obviously don't want to be talking about from Joe Biden. Look, they have made it very clear. The Trump campaign has made it clear. Speaker Johnson has made it clear. The ACA is not going away. What I took that as somebody also who is in the exchange and pays the marketplace rate every single month as my own entity, I can tell you the cost of health care is outrageous in this country. And I think that is the overriding issue, is the cost factor that's being driven here and the overall cost of living. So do there need to be changes and reforms? My guess is you ask the average voter out there, heck yeah, they want to be paying less for health care out there. But look, pre-existing conditions are not going away. None of that stuff is going away. These scare tactics from the Harris campaign are just that, scare tactics. But I would also say we're in 4 or 5 days out of an election. This is what both campaigns do. They glom onto something and try to wrangle it away and get media attention on it.
Joel Payne, you got a thought on that?
Yeah, Scott, 5 days away from an election, I'm glad that Republicans are clarifying what they want to do to the Affordable Care Act, which is gut it. It's what Donald Trump tried to do when he was president. It's what Mike Johnson said he wants to do. I saw a tweet from Mike Lee, one of the leading Senate Republicans in the Senate, who said, kill Obamacare now. So I think they're being crystal clear, and I think that's helpful for voters to know as they go into the voting booth throughout this week and into next week.
So many divisive issues. We can all agree the dog picture behind Lance is crazy awesome. Joel Payne, Lance Trover, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Young voters in battleground states could be swaying this election. Next, we talk to a reporter fresh off a college tour who asked students what's impacting their vote. You're streaming America Decides. College voters could help swing the election in the battleground states, and our next guest has been on a tour talking to students about how they view the candidates. Here's some of what he heard this week in Wayne State University in Detroit.
I can't make that decision to give either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump my vote.
Do you want her to lose Michigan?
Honestly, yeah.
My personal stance will always be with Palestine until my last breath. But I do think that in order to help the rest of the world, we have to start where we are. And I think that Kamala Harris is our best bet.
Good work on that. Let's bring back in Peter Hamby, host of Snapchat's Good Luck America and a partner at Puck News. So, Peter, we clearly see Gaza's a powerful issue with young voters, but how widespread is it as an issue with young voters?
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's interesting. It depends what campus you go to. That clip you just showed from Wayne State in Detroit has a pretty sizable Arab and Muslim student population. There are about 250,000 Arab and Muslim voters in Michigan. And among those students that I talked to, it was very hard to find enthusiasm for Kamala Harris. We found 5 Jill Stein voters out of just randomly pulling 30 people on campus. The last woman that you saw there in that clip was voting for Kamala Harris, but in a very pained way because they associate her with Joe Biden, his support for Israel, the war in Gaza. That issue didn't come up at the other campuses we went to. We went to Penn State, we went to UNC Charlotte, we hit a bunch of campuses. Interestingly, the only other place it really came up, Scott, was at the Savannah College of Art and Design down in Georgia, a private art school, lots of progressive young women. They talked about issues that some would consider boutique issues, not kitchen table issues, in other words, identity politics, trans issues, Gaza. They were less likely to talk about the economy and healthcare. If we went to a larger public school, a commuter school like Cleveland State, for example, those students, young, diverse, middle class, working class, were much more likely to bring up the economy, prices. Well, if they were voting for Trump, if they were voting for Harris, then Gaza. So Gaza, look, I think it's an issue that students who can afford to care about. And for the students that I talked to in Detroit, it's obviously existential to them because their friends, relatives, and community are directly affected by it.
Well, let's drill down on Cleveland State a bit. You found a ticket splitter, an outwardly open ticket splitter. Let me listen to the exchange you had with him.
I consider myself a right-leaning moderate, so I'm going to be voting for Trump in the presidential. Locally, though, I'll be voting for Sherrod Brown just because he backs more unions.
You're a ticket splitter, man. You're the rare ticket splitter.
Well, you have to be moderate. You have to. You can't just go one way or the other. If you don't have bipartisanship, nothing in this country will ever get done.
All right. First of all, strong pull finding him. But I'm actually wondering, is that common or is he a unicorn?
To me and you, Scott, I think he's a unicorn. Our friend Amy Walter at the Cook Political Report gave me a shout out on Twitter for finding an actual ticket splitter. I saw a sign on Twitter today from somebody in Arizona who found a Ruben Gallego Donald Trump sign. Blueprint, the Democratic polling firm that issues messaging guidance to Democrats, they say that among this very small sliver of swing voters and undecideds that are still out there, about half of them say they might split their ticket. It's very hard to find, though, I must say. We randomly stumbled upon that student. He was a member of a labor union. Obviously, in Ohio, Sherrod Brown has a really strong relationship and rapport with labor. And, you know, that student right there, whether viewers disagree with it or not, he thinks that divided government is a good thing. So I did find that to be pretty rare, though. That was the only ticket splitter we found. But I will say, Scott, among all these young students, there were a lot of undecided voters. You found Kamala Harris voters who were, you know, sympathetic to the idea of voting for Trump as a businessman, that he might be good on the economy. And a lot of these young folks don't remember a lot of the drama of the Trump years. Some of them were in high school, even middle school, when he came down the escalator in 2015. So they associate him perhaps with lower prices or being funny on the internet. And they don't have some of the negative associations that perhaps some older voters do. But we'll see what happens.
We have just a moment left. Did you notice an enthusiasm gap from those who claim that they're Harris voters or Trump voters?
The two biggest groups that I found to be the most enthusiastic were young women of color, many of whom on these campuses had just registered to vote, 18, 19, 20 years old, very excited to vote for Kamala Harris. And then, unusually perhaps, given the traditions of voting, younger white men were excited for Trump. But those were the two most excited groups I talked to, Scott, yeah.
Peter Hamby in L.A., thank you very much.
Thank you.
Trick-or-treaters are out in full force tonight, but President Biden was at the White House handing out treats last night. Here he is with a young candy enthusiast dressed as a chicken. The White House has a storied history of Halloween celebrations that all began in 1958 with Dwight D. Eisenhower and continued with his successor, John F. Kennedy. That's Halloween 1963, the former president enjoying his kids, Caroline and John Jr., in costume. Fast forward to 2002, President George W. Bush carrying on the tradition with a new generation of trick-or-treaters. Let's look at a few more special moments in recent White House Halloween history.
We hope, parents, that on this day at least, you don't have to pay attention to Michelle and healthy eating.
I cannot believe the media produced such beautiful children.
That's the candy on the minion. New election laws could make it more difficult for voters with disabilities to cast their ballot this year. We'll explain why thousands of people may not be able to vote this year in Louisiana. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. A projected 40.2 million people with disabilities are eligible to vote this election, according to a recent Rutgers University study. For many, voting by mail is the most accessible way to cast their ballots. But growing restrictions to mail-in voting are creating new challenges for voters with disabilities. Our Katie Weiss spoke with one Louisiana woman at the heart of a legal battle looking to overturn these laws.
For Ashley Volion, accessibility is a constant concern. Volion has spastic cerebral palsy and requires assistance with daily tasks.
If you didn't have those services every day, what would that be for you?
I honestly don't know what I would do because they help me live my life as independently and as inclusive in the community as possible.
Volion also needs help when casting her vote.
I do absentee ballots by mail. Here in Louisiana, to cast your absentee ballot, you have to get a witness to sign.
But new state election laws passed this summer make it illegal to help more than one person who's not an immediate family member.
What was your first reaction?
I just worried a lot about people casting their ballot. I worried for my self-rights.
Louisiana's Secretary of State Nancy Landry says the new laws are intended to protect the state's elections. Since 2016, Louisiana has only seen 3 cases of election fraud. But advocates argue the laws are disenfranchising the over 1 million disabled voters and residents of over 1,300 care facilities who may rely on assistance. According to the Brennan Center, since 2020, more than 20 states have passed laws restricting mail-in ballots. Attorney Andrew Beiser is representing Disability Rights Louisiana and Volion in their lawsuit against Louisiana's Secretary of State and Attorney General.
In what way do you feel these laws are violating federal voting rights?
The Voting Rights Act says that folks with disabilities have the right to assistance in voting by the person of their choosing. These new laws restrict who they can choose.
The goal? Overturning these laws.
It is pushing this false narrative that voting by mail is unsafe. My clients are innocent victims in this ridiculous political argument. They just want to vote.
Without everyone having their right to speak their voice, you don't get to hear the voices of those in your democracy or in your country.
And CBS News reporter Katie Weiss joins us now here on set. Secretary of State Nancy Landry and this coalition of legislators got this thing passed. What are they saying about the impact it's having?
Well, Scott, we reached out to the Louisiana Secretary of State for comment, and her office did not respond. We also reached out to 2 sponsors of the laws passed this summer, Louisiana Representative Josh Carlson and Louisiana Senator Caleb Klein-Peter. They also did not respond to our request for comments. Now, the state's Attorney General did send us an email, and they said that these are common sense requirements that we are confident that no disabled voter will be disenfranchised.
So that's the politics of this. There's a lawsuit you mentioned. Where does that stand?
Well, so far, the plaintiff's attorneys have asked a judge for a preliminary injunction, which would temporarily halt the law from going into effect for at least this election year. But so far, that motion was denied.
So does that temporary loss indicate something is coming with the ultimate outcome?
You would think that maybe that sets a tone for what the lawsuit might, incur, but the plaintiffs tell me that they are feeling hopeful regardless of that setback. And actually, there is some wind in their sails right now. There are some similar laws restricting ballot assistance in Ohio that were struck down in a lawsuit earlier this year. And the judge called it a, quote, clear violation of a federally guaranteed voting right.
You had this one example. Do we have a sense of how many people, though, could be prevented because of these new laws from getting access to voting?
I think a lot still remains to be seen. We have inquired with the State Secretary of State for a data on that or some numbers, but we have not yet received a response. And I really don't think that we'll know the breadth of the full impact of this law or these laws that were passed earlier this summer until after the election. So, of course, Scott, we'll be sure to keep you posted.
Excellent work reporting from Louisiana. Katie Weiss, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that does it for today. We're back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.